They believe that I was pursuing a married man. Not that I was being manipulated and abused by a man they referred to as evil at the beginning of this letter, who was doing everything in his power to discredit his victim in order to stay out of jail.
Welcome to Perverted Justice. This is not just a story. It's a call to action for integrity and radical honesty, in spite of personal cost. Now here's your host, Shielagh Clark.
Welcome back. This is episode 13. So we finished with the criminal prosecution last episode, and I promised that I would address a letter from the Nargis this time and then get back into the timeline of the civil process. So just as a reminder, we are currently in April of 2021. After Weaver's conviction, the Nargis sent a message to my sister insisting that Pete had no knowledge of the abuse prior to disclosure. And I'm not going to cover that issue again. If you missed it, go listen to episode 8. But I do want to quickly address the strategies that they employed, and then we'll move on. Their letter opened with some, in my opinion, counterfeit sympathy, using very emotional language like, "Our hearts have always ached for Shielagh, and we grieve the damage that was done by that monster, Jonathan." And then next, they were a genuine person, would have taken the opportunity to acknowledge what they've learned in the years since the abuse disclosure, or to apologize for any behavior of theirs that was harmful to me because of their lack of understanding at the time, or, something like that. The Nargis just doubled down on their position that they were powerless. And everything bad that happened was someone else's fault, including mine, by the way. They said things like Pete wasn't on the board, so he wasn't aware of decisions that were made, and maybe people treated her horribly wrongly, but it was really us who was calling for good treatment of Shielagh, and there was no knowledge. We grieve that there was no knowledge on how to proceed when this was disclosed, but they don't attach that lack of knowledge or the subsequent damage to themselves. They acknowledge no duty of their own to have known, to have responded well, to apologize for having not responded well. And then they attempt to discredit my memory by weaponizing my trauma. They said that I admitted that my thinking was distorted by Weaver's manipulation, and that even my attorney claimed in court documents that I can't remember everything. First of all, nobody can remember everything, but I do wish that my brain would let me forget some things. And they proceed to twist my continued abuse so that it sounds like it was actually an affair. And then they claim that telling that story is the only way that they could possibly defend themselves against my inaccurate claims. So they're choosing godly silence over defending themselves against false accusations. Please don't miss the irony of them claiming that they're being silent while they're literally telling the lie that they claim to be keeping a secret, and pretending that they haven't told all of their friends already. They were not being silent, and so this continued insistence that they are being godly and quiet is a blatant misrepresentation of what's actually happening. So the reader is just left believing that a magic switch had been flipped at some point, and my abuse had sort of morphed into a consensual affair. I do think that the Nargis have convinced themselves that this is true. In his deposition, Pete claimed that they were just trying to help me, and my attorney pressed him to explain what it was they were trying to help me with. His response was, "We were helping her not to pursue this man." And that statement is critical to understanding the Nargis' position. They believe that I was pursuing a married man. Not that I was being manipulated and abused by a man they referred to as evil at the beginning of this letter, who was doing everything in his power to discredit his victim in order to stay out of jail. And I really think that they refuse to shift this view, despite mounting evidence that they are incorrect, because it's critical to their self-perception. If they ever finally accept that I was continuing to be abused after Weaver left town, they would have to come to terms with their horrendous handling of my plea for help. And that would be very difficult to square with this image of innocence and powerlessness that they're currently projecting. And to be clear, this behavior is not unique to the Nargis. Self-protective rewriting of history reveals a deeper unwillingness to confront one's own failures. This is typical behavior. Admitting failure privately is hard enough. Doing it publicly and under scrutiny is brutal. But if the church is ever going to get this right, it must accurately address the past. The past was public. The fixing needs to be public. And I'm sorry if that was frustrating to listen to, because I really didn't cover the events that they're referring to in the letter. But that's all stuff that I plan to cover in season 2 when I address the abuse itself. But I did think that understanding the Nargi's mindset in the hours and days after Weaver's conviction was important for this process, because I'm really disappointed that not even the conviction was able to tip the scales enough to produce just enough honest self-reflection that could have begun to heal the rift. So once the criminal case was done, discovery finally started to move along in the civil case. They had sent several pretty standard demands, including medical and therapy record demands. And also they sent what's called a Bill of Particulars, or a BOP, which basically demands that I elaborate on the specific dates and locations and people involved and details of every incident that was alleged in the complaint. So I was finally able to clarify my statements about Pete in that document, which brought me considerable relief. And another adjustment that we actually made in that document was, I'm not looking at the complaint right now, but I had mentioned a time in 2002 when I was molested at Camp Calvary. And in my internet sleuthing, I actually found evidence that that event actually happened in 2001. I thought that it happened when I was 17. It actually happened when I was 16. In order to be sure, I wound up calling Camp Calvary, and they sent me documents. They sent me the proof that I needed, that the date that I was molested there at Camp Calvary was actually in 2001. And so we adjusted that, because in the complaint, the original complaint, it says it happened in 2002. And so we were able to shift that. I think my brain was really struggling to cope with what was happening. And when I put these things on the timeline properly, specifically this Camp Calvary incident, it makes me realize just how rapidly things progressed that summer. The abuse was actually progressing much faster than I had originally allowed myself to remember. Anyway, that was a rabbit trail. The judge partially granted Weaver's motion to dismiss the case against himself. And the least complicated way that I can think to explain that is the judge decided that Weaver was going to stay in the suit, but the church was going to need to indemnify him. So Weaver did answer the church's complaint, and I will link both. I don't think I ever linked the church's complaint before. I'll link to both the complaint and Weaver's answer in the show notes. I'm not going to get into trying to dissect it. It's basically, he just argues that nothing's his fault, and if I incurred damages, then they were the responsibility of a third party, not him. I mean, exactly what we would expect from someone who is just refusing to tell the truth. So months passed for all of this to happen. And in the beginning of 2022, Weaver's attorney called my attorney to ask if I would be willing to settle the case for $300,000. To be clear, this is not my settlement. I am not permitted to discuss my settlement, and I will not discuss my settlement. But settlement negotiations are no longer confidential because the church's attorney decided to put them on the internet. So I can talk about them. I don't know why it was Weaver's attorney that called mine to offer the church's insurance policy, but I don't need to know. But that was the limit on their insurance policy, and I rejected the offer immediately and told my attorney that I wanted people to have to answer hard questions. I did not want the money, and I was not going to walk away right before I'm about to get all the answers I've been pushing for. Don't misunderstand. I did not expect everybody to come to their deposition and tell the truth. But I did expect for people to have to answer hard questions. And I knew that I was going to be able to get closer to the truth by asking people questions, whether they intended to tell the whole truth or not. So it was shortly after that offer that Weaver's demands about knocked me off my feet. Because he's a party to the lawsuit now, he gets to have his own list of demands. And he demanded all of my private messages be downloaded from every social media platform and turned over to them. I almost called it quits. I told my attorneys that I was done, and Kat had to convince me to stay in the game and not let them beat me. This was such an invasion of my privacy. And not only my privacy, I had had many people reach out and confide in me. Other women told me their stories, and I was not okay at all with just releasing this information to Weaver and the church. It took me a minute to come to terms with this. But I was finally able to secure some anonymity for the people who disclosed to me. And the messages pertaining to another active CBA case in New York were redacted. So this gave me some peace about complying, but it was still a huge violation. I'd been stripped of every modicum of privacy. Obviously, the church and Weaver hoped to catch some inconsistency in my story that they could weaponize against me. And once I got over the initial shock of the request and I turned over the messages, I started to feel a different peace because I realized that this was really a win for me. It was still very much a violation, but it was a win because there was nothing there for them to catch. I am a person of integrity. My words matched my actions. My public posts matched my private messages. My publicly stated goals matched my private hopes. Integrity is basically being whole or undivided, being the same all the way through. And this demand, which was such a violation, I did not want to downplay that. It was horrible. But it actually proved that I was those things. I was the same out front as I was behind the curtain. And I just thought, what a disappointment that must have been for them on their end. So in the spring of 2022, after I rejected the offer and made no counter demand, after I turned over my messages, the church petitioned the court to force me to give them a dollar amount. My attorney explained what the church wanted, and we discussed what number we were going to respond with. He said that he thought my case deserved at least a $5 million price tag, but he thought that it was best to come in closer to $3 million so that we seem more reasonable to the judge. I begged to know how sure he was that the church would not accept that offer. I was terrified that they were going to find some extra pot of money that would allow them to meet the demand and end the lawsuit. He told me that he was pretty confident this number was high enough that that wouldn't happen. But he added, if they come back with an offer of $2 million, we may need to discuss foregoing the depositions and just taking the offer. But I don't expect them to do that. I asked him to please include in the letter that I wanted depositions, and he promised that he would do that. I felt angry at the possibility of being forced to take money that I didn't want, or in place of the answers that I did want. And I was really on the edge of my seat, waiting for assurance that this would not change anything about the course going forward. So I'm going to go ahead and read the letter to you. The purpose of this letter is to inform you that our client will agree to settle any and all claims against Hyde Park Baptist Church for a total of $3.5 million. I have addressed abuse-related cases within faith communities for almost 30 years. This is one of the most egregious cases I have handled. The notice issue is clear, and the damages are profound. To be honest, there is no amount of money that will ever be able to adequately compensate Miss Clark for trauma that was perpetrated upon her by Weaver and your client. Should your client reject the above-referenced demand, we propose that we complete this initial round of depositions and then schedule a mediation with the hope that we can move towards a final resolution. In addition to the deposition of Miss Clark, we want to schedule the depositions of the following individuals as part of this initial round: Valentine, Bradford, Buccio, Gonzalez, Nargi, Weaver. We look forward to working with your office and getting these depositions scheduled. Don't hesitate to contact me should you have any questions as we press forward. So that letter went to the church in March. I think it's dated March 29. But I didn't receive a copy of this letter until June. And as you clearly heard, the wording about the depositions wasn't quite what I asked for. And I know that there were legal reasons for this, but it was still a bit of a shock for me to read it because I had assumed that it very clearly said that I wanted depositions. Since 1994, a growing number of churches have been taking time to pray for child abuse victims and their rescuers on the last Sunday in April each year, and they call that day Blue Sunday. On Blue Sunday, April 24, 2022, Richard Murray took no time out of their service to pray for victims of abuse, but he ended his live stream with this announcement.
So don't forget to stay. Alex got a very important message about the lawsuit that we're going to share with you here this morning. And certainly God is good. Never forget that. Amen. He stood up on time when Stephen was stoned.
He stood up on time when Stephen was stoned. Translation: we are being persecuted by Shielagh, but don't lose heart. God is on our side. The live feed ended there, but I had some eyes and ears in the room, and I was told that Alex got up in front of the church, read that letter with zero context, cried about how he just wants a peaceful resolution, and then the church broke up into groups to pray for their money. Has a single Hyde Park Baptist Church leader ever stood in that pulpit and cried actual tears over what happened to me? Not once. Not one time. But threaten their beloved money, and the tears start flowing. Alex made it sound like I had just randomly demanded $3.5 million from them. He totally left out the fact that they had petitioned the court to force me to give them a number that I didn't want to give. Additionally, when Alex says he wants a peaceful resolution, in my opinion, what he means is that he wants this to go away without it costing them anything. He does not mean that he wants to come to the table and engage with me to make peace. Those are very different things, and it's very important to highlight the distinction. But besides all of that, settlement negotiations were supposed to be confidential. Alex broke confidentiality by getting up in front of the whole congregation to read this letter. And I was really angry about it But I was also bound by confidentiality, and apparently the only one who cared about the fact that we were bound by confidentiality. So I couldn't correct the actual issue publicly, so I just made a video about Alex breaking confidentiality and crying over their money, which, of course, was not received well. This is actually the third in, I think, a series of 4 videos that I did called What'd Marie Say?, where I was just pulling parts of his sermons out and stitching them into videos short videos, so that I could put them online publicly and people could see what was really going on behind the scenes. People who go to other churches aren't sitting and listening to Marie preach. I let my ears bleed for you. You're welcome. And I prepared some videos, and none of them made anyone very happy. But after I put this particular one up, I heard through the rumor mill that I was being called a liar. Again, it's people's favorite thing to call me. So I vented on Facebook. And I did later put this post to private, and I apologized because I swore. I don't like swearing, so if you don't want to hear me swear, you should cover your ears. But this is what I said. Maybe instead of calling me a liar because you don't like what I'm saying your friends are doing, you should go tell your friends to stop doing the shit they're doing. Wouldn't it be something if for once I got the benefit of the doubt, not the men who harmed me? And wouldn't it be nice if people were moved to act on my behalf, not just on the behalf of the men who harmed me? Don't tell me that I am not allowed to be angry. And don't tell me that I'm the bad guy for simply showing people what is happening. Get up the butt of someone who deserves it and leave me alone. And you might be listening and thinking that I'm being too hard on Alex because he wasn't privy to my private discussions with my attorneys. But remember a few minutes ago when I said that I had to give them all of my private messaging? My private messaging is full of what I wanted. It is overflowing with conversations where I repeat over and over, I don't want their money. I want the truth. I would settle this lawsuit for an independent investigation and an apology. Over and over. Do you think that any of that made its way back to the congregation? Not a chance. If they had wanted to know how to achieve a peaceful resolution, all they had to do was look. All they had to do was pay attention. All they had to do was believe me. And I was actually able to confront Alex about these things in July of that same year, but I can't jump ahead to that. That has to wait. The summer of 2022 was wild, and all of it is important. So we're just going to have to be camping out here in summer of 2022 for a handful of episodes, I think. So my deposition was the Friday after Alex's tearful announcement of my evil plans to destroy the church. And it went really well. It was very scary at first, but it went really well. And my attorneys made some comments like I had done so well that they expected that the church would want to come to the table to negotiate a better settlement than $300,000, which was distressing to me because that's not what I wanted at all. And also, right before my deposition, the church dropped Jonathan out of the lawsuit. So they kept him in long enough to destroy the criminal case and wreak other havoc on my life. And then right before depositions, they dropped him out. And I don't have any evidence to prove this. There's some circumstantial evidence, really, but no proof. But I do believe that there was an agreement between the church and Weaver that he would testify in their defense if this went to trial, if they dropped him out of the lawsuit. And we'll get there, but that's exactly what Weaver did. We didn't get all the way to trial, but his trial testimony was recorded before trial in Pennsylvania, and he did exactly that. So they dropped him out. I had my deposition. Attorneys are talking about settlement. I'm frustrated because I want answers. And then the night before the church's deposition, I messaged asking for a link so that I could get into the Zoom meeting and be present for this deposition. And my attorney said, "What link? What's tomorrow?" It's like, the church's deposition. And he said, "Oh, we canceled that because we're in settlement negotiations." And I said, "I want depositions, not settlement." Then he said, "We don't schedule depositions for the sake of scheduling depositions." And so I said, "Well, then I guess there's nothing else I want in this process, so I guess it's over." So he told me that I should write them a list of what it is that I want from this process. And I was like, how are we 2 years into this and at least through 6 cycles of this conversation, and you're still confused about what it is that I want from this process? But I agreed to write the list, and then I went to therapy and I vented. And my therapist encouraged me to not just write a list, but to write a letter to my attorneys about how I was actually experiencing this process and what I needed, which I did. I did write that letter, and I will read it to you. I'm trying to omit names. I was asked to make a list of what I wanted from this process. After discussing my distress at length with my therapist, she encouraged me to write a letter explaining where I'm at. We both agreed that you have my best interest at heart, and you would want to know how I am truly experiencing this process. Before I get into that, I want to reiterate that I am aware that there is much I do not understand. I am constantly trying to balance my expectations with reality as I learn more. I hope we can find a way to make space for what I really need from this. I have had to give up every ounce of privacy, to tell and retell painful and embarrassing things, to turn over private messages to my abuser, to discover the state values the perpetrator over the victim in so many ways. I was not expecting the depth of that violation, but I adjusted to it, expecting that at some point in the civil process, the scales would tip. I hung on, reminding myself that their turn in the hot seat was coming. However, to date, the perpetrators of harm have sat in silence, giving nothing. I knew the lawsuit would end with money somehow, and I want you to be paid for your efforts. But I didn't realize that accountability was figurative and answers were dollars. My idea of justice was truth-telling and setting the record straight. It was backing bad actors into corners with questions that they've never had to answer. I wasn't even expecting honesty from them so much as making them uncomfortable by framing their actions accurately, naming the truth, and recording their answers officially on the record. Everything else is he said, she said, and I lose in that scenario every single time. Now we are finally standing on the threshold of their turn, and I'm finding the door is locked. To endure the hell that I have for the last 2 years, just to be told that the destination ahead was a mirage, is absolutely devastating. I keep being told I'm in the driver's seat, but if I am, I'm sitting here blindfolded and in handcuffs. When the church offered to settle the first time, I declined, stating I wanted people to answer hard questions. When the offer letter was drafted, I was assured that he was including a statement explaining that his client wanted to get through this first round of depositions. The letter doesn't quite read that way, but it's close. I felt like I've been clear about depositions being my goal, so I also feel like I should have been included in the conversation concerning postponing or potentially canceling the church's deposition. I wasn't even informed it had been called off until the day before when I asked for a link. There are painful aspects that I understand will never be remedied. None of us can make the church do the right thing, and no amount of insurance money is going to make me feel like I held the church accountable. Someone else footing the bill is a win for them and gives them zero reason to treat another victim any differently in the future. Those things cannot be changed, and I am working on acceptance. After my conversation with you 2 weeks ago, I considered just checking out and letting you finish this off however you see fit. I struggle to voice my needs, much less my wants, and on top of that, I'm doubting the validity of both in this situation because I feel like your experience in this should automatically trump my desire to see it go a slightly different direction. If what I want is so far out in left field, I feel like I should be adjusting my expectations, not trying to bend the legal process to my agenda. But I don't want to waste an opportunity I won't get again, so I have questions. And then I went on to ask about costs associated with depositions and who foots the bill, and could depositions be part of a settlement agreement, even if that's unorthodox. And anyway, the rest of the letter really isn't all that important. But the point is, actually, I think there's a couple of points there. The first one being, I was very clear about what I wanted. I wasn't just fighting my lawsuit and fighting the church and trying to get through this process. I was literally just fighting with my attorneys to try to keep us on course, to use the civil process in a way that accomplished what I needed. And I think the application here is that the church could have been doing the same thing. And they weren't. The church was, as we've already discussed, just sort of like outsourcing their morality to their attorney, checking out, letting the attorney do whatever, however, and then pretending that they were powerless. And there were lots of times that I felt powerless in this civil process, but I held onto the reins really tightly because maintaining my integrity in this process was so important to me. And it's just wild to sit back and realize that those things didn't matter to the church. They felt no obligation to direct their side of things in an ethical way. Anyway, that was a lot. It was a major information dump. But if you made it this far, thanks for listening.
If your community is dedicated to fostering a safe and supportive environment, connect with Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, at netgrace.org. Grace's mission is to empower Christian communities to recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse effectively. They provide vital resources and training to help churches understand the complexities of abuse and adopt effective prevention policy and trauma-informed responses.